After Munich, the advice to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was unanimous and painfully predictable. Disappear for a minute, stop feeding the flames, go back to the Bronx, let the noise burn itself out. She took that advice the way she takes most advice from people who don't have to live inside her spotlight, which is to say, she ignored it with purpose. Instead of shrinking, she opened Instagram Live to a crowd measured in the millions and dared the President of the United States to meet her on a debate stage with the whole country watching. Within a day, Donald Trump answered in the blunt little shorthand he uses when he wants something to feel inevitable rather than negotiated. 3 words, no punctuation, like a door swinging open. Name, date, time. Her staff sold it as courage, because staff always sells courage when the alternative is admitting panic. The press sold it as history, because the press sells history the way sports radio sells game of the century, and for the same reason. It keeps you tuned in. The donor class sold it as opportunity, because donors don't invest in virtue. They invest in attention that can be turned into leverage. Even the skeptics couldn't deny the hook was perfect. The kind of hook you can explain to someone in 10 seconds at a gas station. A sitting president, a sitting congresswoman, a live audience, prime time, and a country that never misses a chance to watch 2 people gamble their futures. 14 days later, the debate was packaged as a national event, with the kind of production values that make politics feel like theater, and theater feel like destiny. It was billed as a special, staged in an iconic room, and carried everywhere by networks that complained about the venue and then showed up anyway. The chandeliers, the velvet, the curated crowd, the split tickets, the moderator with the polished voice, all of it designed to tell viewers this mattered. Ocasio-Cortez treated it like a trial, which is how serious people prepare when they think the rules will protect the work. Trump treated it like television, which is how experienced performers prepare when they know the work is the rules. The Munich fallout was still raw, and that was the point, whether her team admitted it out loud or not. The clips had metastasized into shorthand. The Taiwan hesitation, the geography stumble, the scattered edits turning complexity into comedy, late-night jokes, cable loops, and that uniquely modern punishment where a moment gets replayed so many times it stops being a moment and becomes your name. And yet, the base numbers were still strong, the arena crowds still loud, the youth polls still flattering enough to tempt anyone into thinking the internet is the electorate. What she didn't have, and what every ambitious politician eventually needs, was the kind of credibility that doesn't come from applause. Her inner circle fractured into 2 familiar camps, the people who hear danger and the people who hear opportunity. One side warned her that Trump doesn't debate the way normal politicians debate, that he turns the stage into a rally and the opponent into a prop. The other side pointed to history the way gamblers point to hot streaks, insisting that surviving a bully is half the battle and retail instinct could carry the rest. Ocasio-Cortez made the call with a sentence that sounded like destiny to the people who wanted destiny, and like catastrophe to the people who feared it. If you want the job, she told them, you don't get to keep ducking the person who's holding it. On Instagram Live, she looked straight into the lens and delivered the kind of challenge that makes supporters feel like they're watching a turning point. She framed it as simple. You called me ignorant? You called me an embarrassment? Fine, prove it, in public, with the country as witness. She gave him the escape hatch, any network, any day, while making the refusal itself look like fear. Her team called it a masterstroke, which is what you call a move that feels bold before you find out what it costs. Trump's advisors tried to kill it, because advisors tend to hate anything they can't control. Trump looked at them with the expression he saves for people who don't understand the one thing he always understands: attention. Beneath you, an aide reportedly argued, as if rank determines what viewers watch. Trump's answer, whether you believe the exact wording or just the vibe, was basically this: if millions will tune in, it's not beneath anything. He posted the acceptance quickly, without conditions that would make it seem negotiated, because negotiation is weakness on camera. And with that, the event became real, which is the moment every brave idea stops being brave and starts being risk. Ocasio-Cortez prepared like someone who thought the night would be graded on substance. 2 weeks of debate camp, stacks of briefing memos, mock opponents trained to interrupt and needle, timed answers drilled until they could be delivered in her sleep. She assembled a set of visual aids, charts, numbers, bright labels, because she's built a reputation for turning hearings into classrooms. In her mind, the boards were insurance, a way to anchor the conversation to data when the opponent tried to float it into vibes. She was ready in the way students are ready when they've studied the material and expect the exam to match it. Trump, according to the folklore that always blooms around him, did the opposite of what his opponents consider responsible. He spent the day like a man convinced the opponent is preparing for the wrong sport, because he's playing a different one. An aide offered him a sheet of her positions. He barely glanced, because he wasn't planning to fight her ideas in the way she meant. When told she was bringing boards, he treated it like a gift, not a threat, because props are easy to turn into punchlines. He arrived late because lateness is dominance in certain rooms, and politics is made of room. Ocasio-Cortez got there early and absorbed the weight of the venue the way anyone would when their life story is about to be tested in public. She looked at the audience, the stage lights, the moderator's desk, and tried to slow her breathing the way her coaches taught her. Her team fussed over sound and lighting, as if perfect audio could guarantee a perfect moment. She stood at her podium and tried to imagine the country watching, because the country is easier to address than the man 10 feet away. Then Trump walked in, glanced at the boards, and smiled like he'd just been handed the first joke of the night. The moderator opened with rules, because moderators always open with rules, even when everybody knows rules are only as strong as the person willing to ignore them. The first question was about affordability, and Ocasio-Cortez began exactly as she'd rehearsed, speaking to Americans watching at home. She cited rent, groceries, and medicine, and reached toward the first chart with the calm certainty of someone moving to a planned beat. Trump cut in early, not with a rebuttal, but with a comment about the boards themselves, treating them like a school project. Laughter did what laughter always does in a live room. It changed the temperature before the argument even began. She held the pointer steady, but the room had already relabeled her evidence as a prop. Trump kept going, because once the crowd laughs, the performer knows he owns the rhythm, and rhythm is power. He tossed in a question about cost and who paid, dragging the conversation toward ethics and optics, the swampy terrain where details drown. Ocasio-Cortez tried to steer back to policy with a line about seriousness and families, which is what you do when your work is being turned into a skit. But you can't deliver a spreadsheet while the other person is delivering stand-up, not when the audience came for the show. She attempted to plant her feet and continue anyway, because stubbornness is one of her genuine strengths. Trump answered the policy in the broad, boastful way that lets supporters hear victory and lets critics hear exaggeration. Then, he flipped the knife by pointing out that she'd held the seat for years and asked why local pain was still pain, a question that sounds simple and therefore sticks. The moderator tried to regain control, but control is hard to reclaim once a room has decided the entertaining person is the driver. Viewers watched a familiar mismatch, one candidate trying to litigate, the other trying to perform. and performance is faster. The debate moved to taxes and billionaires, and she abandoned the boards to speak more directly, which was smart and also too late. She framed taxing the wealthy as fairness, not punishment, and started to name names because names make policy feel real. Trump pounced on the names, pivoting to job creation, turning the billionaire into a symbol of industry, and the congresswoman into a symbol of resentment. He asked how many jobs she'd created, delivering the punchline before the question had even landed. She tried to explain the difference between private wealth and public obligation, but the sentence had too many parts for a room already laughing. Then came the Met Gala, because politics in this era is less about what you believe than where your image can be placed. Trump described it as a rich person festival, with a ticket price and a red carpet, because those details paint the hypocrisy picture quickly. He framed her tax the rich dress as an irony machine, a costume worn at the very party she condemns, which is the kind of contradiction that writes itself. When he invoked reported scrutiny and a monetary penalty, he did it the way he invokes everything, not as a legal claim to prove, but as a story to brand. Ocasio-Cortez tried to explain charity and context, but context loses when the room is already picturing champagne and cameras. The third question was the one every incumbent fears when they're being measured against an executive. What did you actually get done? She answered the way legislators without signature laws often answer, by arguing that shifting the agenda is its own form of power. Trump repeated the phrase, shifted the conversation, like he was tasting it for weakness, then dismissed it as influencer language. He reduced 7 years into a single number, 0, because numbers are easy to chant and hard to nuance. And when he compared crowds and celebrity to the entertainment industry, the room laughed again, because the absurdity carried a painful hint of truth. She reached for Medicaid and moral urgency, trying to reframe him as cruel and herself as defender, because that's a fight she's won before. Trump didn't argue the moral frame directly. He pulled the focus back to fraud, waste, and competence, because competence is where moral arguments get strangled. He linked her to allies and outrage patterns, suggesting she attacks audits and shields dysfunction, a narrative that doesn't require proof in the moment to feel plausible. Ocasio-Cortez tried to pull him back into specifics, but he kept sliding into portrait painting, because portraits are what audiences remember. The boards remained unused, bright rectangles of preparation fading into the background like unused homework. When the moderator finally steered into foreign policy, Ocasio-Cortez tried to preempt Munich by broadening her message to human rights and global solidarity. Trump seized the word Munich like a trigger, and the crowd knew what was coming before it came, which is the cruelest part of a replay. He imitated the hesitations, the filler, the stops and starts, and the impression was devastating because it sounded like the clip everyone had already seen. The laughter that followed wasn't just partisan laughter. It was the laughter of recognition, and recognition is what turns a meme into a scar. She stood there and felt what every public figure fears, the moment when preparation meets ridicule and preparation loses. She tried to pivot by accusing him of acting first and thinking later, a line that plays well when the audience is your followers. Trump shifted gears, dropped the comedy, and spoke in a lower register about outcomes and suffering, because he knows gravity is a weapon too. He framed his actions as decisive and hers as performative, not by citing statutes or treaties, but by telling a story with victims and villains. Whatever you think of the morality, the effect was obvious. He had made himself the man of action and made her the woman of commentary. And in a room full of viewers conditioned to reward doers, commentary sounds like surrender. The closing statements arrived like the final round of a fight, where everyone already senses who has the momentum. Ocasio-Cortez delivered the origin story that made her famous. Bartender to Congress, the voice of working people, the promise to fight for families. It was sincere, and sincerity still matters. But sincerity isn't the same thing as proof. Trump answered with something shorter and colder, acknowledging the dignity of her past while drawing a line between past identity and present responsibility. Then he asked the simplest, deadliest question he could ask. If your home is still hurting, why should the country hire you? The power of that question wasn't that it was perfectly fair. Politics is rarely perfectly fair. The power was that it was easy to understand and impossible to dodge without sounding evasive. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, and you could almost see the split-second calculation between honesty and spin. Trump landed one more tiny phrase: fight isn't fix. And the phrase did what phrases do. It turned into a caption before the night was over. When the debate ended, he walked off like someone leaving a studio, and she stood still for an extra beat, like someone trying to remember what room she's in. Afterward, the internet did what it does to every modern political moment. It boiled it down into reusable parts. The Bronx question spread first, because it didn't require a policy degree to feel the punch. The Met Gala segment spread second, because hypocrisy is the one bipartisan religion left. The Munich impression spread third, because mockery travels faster than context and always will. And the three-word phrase, fight isn't fix, spread slowest but deepest, because it sounded like something your uncle would say at a kitchen table and mean. Cable coverage split into predictable narratives, but even friendly panels couldn't pretend the night had gone the way her team wanted. Some commentators praised her for showing up, for daring, for taking the hits, which is a compliment you give when you can't say she won. Others celebrated Trump's performance because performance was the currency of the evening, and he had printed it effortlessly. Meanwhile, donors did the quiet math that doesn't need public statements, and some of them paused in that way that feels like a door slowly closing. In politics, pauses are often more consequential than attacks, because attacks can be fought, but pauses become absence. Ocasio-Cortez went home and did the one thing she always does when the world feels hostile. She spoke to her people directly. She went live again, messy on purpose, leaning into imperfection as authenticity, turning loss into a bond. The comments flooded with love and loyalty because her base doesn't just like her, it recognizes itself in her. But buried among the hearts were the harder notes, the ones that aren't hatred, just exhaustion. Rent still rising, groceries still brutal, the neighborhood still tight. Those notes didn't trend because reality rarely trends, but reality is what decides elections. Somewhere back in the Bronx, in the kind of bar where televisions stay on because silence feels lonely, regulars watched the replay. They listened to the question about fixing home and felt the uncomfortable sting of it because it sounded like a common-sense complaint, not a partisan attack. They didn't erupt in outrage, because outrage requires energy, and working people spend their energy on work. They drank, they shrugged, they argued a little, and then they changed the subject, the way people do when a dream starts to feel expensive. And that's the quiet part that scares any politician more than 1,000 insults. When your name stops being a fight and becomes a sigh. The next morning, the country woke up with the same hangover it always wakes up with after a big televised moment, which is to say the moment felt bigger in the replay than it did in real life. And yet the replay was the only life the moment was ever going to have. People didn't talk about the debate the way they used to talk about debates, as competing ideas or competing plans or competing temperaments. They talked about clips, and the clips had already been labeled, packaged, and sold back to them before they'd finished their coffee. One clip was the question about the Bronx, because it was short enough to repeat without mangling it and sharp enough to sound like wisdom. Another clip was the Met Gala segment, because culture war hypocrisy is the one bipartisan genre that never goes out of style. Fox called it a rout, CNN called it a rough night, MSNBC called it a complicated moment, and the internet called it what the internet always calls anything it can reduce to a meme: proof. Ocasio-Cortez's allies issued statements the way allies do when they're trying to help without attaching themselves to a sinking ship, which is to say they praised her courage and voice and willingness to stand up. Nobody praised her win, because praising a win requires a win, and that's the part you can't manufacture with adjectives. Even the people who loved her most were forced to do the one thing her movement had always resisted doing: admit that vibes don't beat a verdict. The phrase, "fight isn't fix," started showing up in places it wasn't supposed to show up, which is how you know something has teeth. It showed up on a hand-lettered sign outside a hardware store in Ohio under a list of prices for plywood and paint. It showed up in the comments under a viral video of a broken elevator in a public housing building, posted by someone who sounded more tired than angry. It showed up on the lips of talk radio callers who didn't have the vocabulary for policy, but had a deep intuition for the difference between being represented and being performed. It showed up in a union hall in Pennsylvania, not as an endorsement of Trump, but as a warning to Democrats: don't confuse noise with competence. And it showed up in the one place that matters more than Twitter, more than cable, more than arena crowds, more than influencer money: the private phone calls. Those phone calls don't go to the people who trend. They go to the people who write checks and expect results. They go to the people who don't care if your supporters love you, because supporters are free and campaigns are not. They go to the people who think in margins and timelines and electability, that dirty word Democrats pretend not to believe in until they need it. The calls started with the same sentence over and over, a sentence that sounded neutral but wasn't. So, what do you think happened last night? And the answers, even from friendly mouths, had the same subtext. She walked into a room she thought she owned and discovered it belonged to someone else. In New York, Ocasio-Cortez's team tried to do what every modern campaign does after a painful clip cycle: flood the zone with new content. They posted behind-the-scenes footage of her prep, because prep is what you show when you want people to believe effort equals outcome. They released long-form policy threads, because policy is what you release when you want the argument to become "she's smart" instead of "she lost." They booked her onto friendly podcasts where the host nods at the right moments and asks questions shaped like compliments. They pushed short videos of Trump interrupting her, hoping the story would become unfair moderator instead of fatal question. But the problem with the Bronx question wasn't that it was unfair, it was that it was plausible. And plausible is a disease you can't mask with content. Inside her world, the debate became a lesson in media ecology. Her base reacted the way bases react. They tightened their grip, they doubled down, they treated critique as betrayal. They treated laughter as violence. It didn't matter that no one had to hate her to laugh at her, because, in the logic of fandom, embarrassment and malice look identical. The more the clips spread, the more loyal her people became, because loyalty is easiest when you can frame everything as an attack. And Ocasio-Cortez, who had built her rise on the ability to turn attacks into fuel, tried to do it again. She went live again, and then again, telling her followers that the real story wasn't the joke, but the pain in the country behind the joke. She talked about rent, about hospitals, about childcare, about the feeling of living on a treadmill that keeps getting faster. She framed Trump's question as a trick question, because trick questions are easier to defeat than real ones. She said fighting is fixing, because sometimes fighting is all you can do when the fixing tools aren't in your hand. And in the moment she said it, you could hear the weakness, not because it was morally wrong, but because it sounded like a justification. The thing about fight isn't fix is that it doesn't accuse anyone of being evil. It accuses them of being ineffective. Americans can forgive a lot of sins if they believe you can deliver, because delivery is the only salvation politics offers. They will tolerate arrogance. They will tolerate chaos. They will tolerate hypocrisy. They will even tolerate a certain amount of cruelty. What they do not tolerate for long is a person who talks like a savior and governs like a spectator. That's why the phrase landed, because it didn't require you to hate her to believe it. Ocasio-Cortez could feel the shift in the way the press asked questions. Before, interviews began with her as the subject, her ideas as the center of gravity, and the world as the thing orbiting her voice. After, interviews began with the debate clip as the center of gravity, and her as the person now required to explain it. Do you regret challenging him? They asked, which is another way of asking, did you overestimate yourself? Do you think you helped him? They asked, which is another way of asking, did you make him look strong? Do you still want to run? They asked, which is another way of asking, do you have the nerve to be embarrassed twice? The hardest part wasn't the hostile questions, because she'd learned how to use hostility as a treadmill for her brand. The hardest part was the polite questions, the ones that sounded like concern, because concern is what you offer someone you've quietly stopped taking seriously. She started to see it in the faces of Democratic leaders, too. The older ones who smiled at her like a proud aunt, and then never called again. She started to hear it in the language used about her. Important voice, vital energy, powerful communicator, as if the highest office in the land is a microphone. And she started to feel it in the way other potential candidates began moving around her, not away from her, but past her. Gretchen Whitmer didn't attack her, because Whitmer doesn't need to attack a wounded ally. Josh Shapiro didn't mock her, because Shapiro understands that patience looks like maturity. J.B. Pritzker didn't even mention her, which is what you do when you're trying to treat someone as a separate species. Not opponent, not ally, just background. Gavin Newsom made a joke about building things instead of trending, and then claimed he wasn't talking about anyone specific, because plausible deniability is the adult version of snark. Kamala Harris went on stage and talked about results, and you could almost hear the word fix echoing behind her like a ghost. Ocasio-Cortez did the only thing she could do if she wanted to survive as more than a brand. She tried to become a legislator again. Not in the performative sense of hearings and viral moments, but in the grinding sense of meetings and coalitions and amendments and, yes, compromises. She announced a housing package with serious wonky guts, the kind of package that makes activists yawn and staffers sweat. She put her name on bills that weren't perfect, which caused parts of her base to accuse her of selling out, because purists always punish growth. She toured her district not with cameras, but with small groups, walking through buildings, meeting with tenants, listening to complaints that couldn't be solved with a quote. And slowly, something almost unheard of began to happen. She started to look less like a celebrity and more like an official. The press didn't know how to cover that version of her, because that version doesn't trend. Quiet work doesn't create clips, and clips are how news survives. But there were signs that mattered more than coverage, like a landlord association privately admitting they expected her to grandstand, and instead she showed up with numbers. Or a union leader saying off the record that she'd finally started asking the annoying questions that lead to actual deals. Or a community board member in Queens telling a reporter, "She's still her, but she's calmer." Calmer is not a word that gets you an arena, but it is a word that gets you credibility. That was the hidden war inside her life after the debate. The war between the version of her that made her famous and the version of her that might make her viable. Fame rewards sharpness. Viability rewards steadiness. Fame rewards conflict. Viability rewards construction. Fame rewards the perfect line. Viability rewards the boring meeting where nobody claps. The debate had revealed something brutal to her. The country might love her fight, but the country also wanted her to fix something, anything, anywhere. She could still be the fighter, but she needed a receipt. Meanwhile, Trump did what Trump always does after he thinks he's won something. He acted like the win was too small for him. He posted about ratings, because ratings are his proof of legitimacy. He thanked her for entertainment, because calling politics entertainment is how you remind the audience that he controls the genre. He mocked the poster boards again because ridicule is easier than argument and lasts longer than argument. He didn't talk about her policies because he didn't need to. In his story, her policies were just scenery. He turned his attention to a new target within 48 hours because nothing terrifies a performer like stagnation. That should have been the final insult to her. Not defeat, but dismissal. Trump's most effective weapon has always been the ability to treat someone's life mission as a bit in his show and then move on. It's not that he wins every exchange on substance, it's that he makes exchanges feel like entertainment, and therefore makes the opponent feel like content. Once you become content, you're no longer a threat, you're a clip. Ocasio-Cortez understood this, maybe more painfully than anyone else, because she had built her own rise through content too. She knew the trap because she'd lived off the trap. In the weeks after the debate, something strange happened in her district that no one on cable noticed. People started asking her for things they'd never asked her for before. Not speeches, not selfies, not the symbolic stuff, but practical help. Zoning fights, tenant disputes, block-by-block safety meetings, potholes, permits. It wasn't that they'd become cynical overnight, it was that the debate had made something clear even to her supporters. If you're going to claim the future, you have to show the present. Her office got flooded with complaints, and for the first time in a long time, the complaints weren't framed as "tell your story," they were framed as "solve my problem." That shift wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and real is what she needed. Her staff hated it, because solving problems is hard, and viral moments are easy. Policy teams love a big bill, but constituent services is where careers go to die quietly under stacks of paperwork. Still, she leaned into it, because she had to, and because she'd started to realize that the Bronx question was only fatal if the Bronx stayed unchanged. If she could point to something tangible, an enforcement win, a housing fix, a project funded, a measurable reduction in some local pain, then the question loses its bite. Not entirely, because politics never forgets, but enough to dull the blade. She began talking less about fighting and more about building, and the word tasted unfamiliar coming out of her mouth. The left online reacted like a jealous lover. They didn't want her to build. They wanted her to burn. They wanted the warrior, not the manager. Because managers are boring, and boredom is betrayal in a digital movement. Every time she compromised, someone accused her of being captured. Every time she sat with a stakeholder, someone accused her of being bought. Every time she softened a slogan into a plan, someone accused her of losing the plot. And that's when Ocasio-Cortez did something that surprised even people who'd watched her for years. She pushed back on her own audience. Not in a dramatic denunciation, not in a "I'm leaving the movement" speech, but in small moments of firmness. She corrected misinformation from her own side the way she used to correct it from the right. She told activists, gently but clearly, that you can't demand outcomes without tolerating process. She reminded people that bills are written by coalitions, not by captions. She started using the phrase, "governing is not performing," which was either a confession or a revolution depending on who was listening. The first time she said it, a clip went mildly viral because irony is always profitable. Commentators snickered. The Instagram queen discovers real life. Opponents framed it as proof she'd been a fraud, which was too convenient to be fully true. Supporters framed it as growth, which might have been true, but also served as damage control. Ocasio-Cortez herself framed it as necessity, because necessity is the only honest explanation that doesn't sound like weakness. You could almost hear her inner argument in every sentence. I am still me, but I can't stay only myself. Around this time, another figure entered the story in a way that made Ocasio-Cortez's situation feel even more precarious. It wasn't a Republican, because Republicans didn't need to do anything. The debate had already done what it did. It was a Democrat who understood the same lesson Trump had weaponized, but without the cruelty. Results create authority. That Democrat started showing up in the same media lanes, podcasts, town halls, cable segments, talking about similar issues with less heat and more receipts. They didn't attack her, they didn't mock her, they just existed as an alternative. And in politics, alternatives are more dangerous than enemies, because enemies keep you relevant. Ocasio-Cortez felt it first in donor chatter, the kind that reaches candidates through side channels. A donor who used to say, "I love her," started saying, "I respect her." A bundler who used to say, "She's the future," started saying, "She's part of the future." An activist group that used to prioritize her events started diversifying, which is the organizational version of keeping your options open. Even Bernie Sanders, her symbolic patron saint, began using language that sounded like a handoff rather than a coronation. "She's important," he said in one interview, and the word important landed like a ceiling. The debate had changed the definition of her in the national mind. Before, she was the disruptor, the icon, the person who could make leadership uncomfortable by existing. After, she was the question mark. Can she deliver anything beyond a performance? Icons can survive endless attacks because icons aren't required to produce outcomes. They're required to produce meaning. Presidents are required to produce outcomes, or at least the feeling of outcomes, which is why Trump's question hit like it did. "Fix something," he had essentially said, and the country nodded because the country is tired. The most revealing moment came in a place no one clips, a closed-door meeting with local leaders in the Bronx. There were no cameras, no ring lights, no viral quotes, just folding chairs and tired faces. A woman who had voted for her every time asked a question that sounded almost apologetic. "Are you still going to be here?" Not in the existential sense, but in the practical sense. Are you going to keep doing the district work, or are you leaving for the national stage? Ocasio-Cortez paused, and that pause was different from Munich. It wasn't confusion, it was honesty wrestling with ambition. "I'm here," she said, and for the first time in weeks, It sounded like a promise instead of a slogan. She began holding small, fixed sessions in different neighborhoods. No speeches, no panels, just targeted meetings on specific issues. Housing first, then transit, then small business permits, then public health. Her team hated the name because it sounded like a direct concession to Trump's line. But she insisted, because sometimes you diffuse a weapon by taking it away. She invited critics, including moderate Democrats who'd never liked her style, and she let them talk. She listened, which is a skill you only learn when you're no longer addicted to being the most interesting person in the room. The press tried to bait her into relitigating the debate, and she refused more often than not. "I said what I said," she'd answer, which is a polite way of saying, "I'm not feeding you another clip." When asked about Trump's Bronx question, she didn't cry, she didn't rage, she didn't treat it like persecution. She treated it like a performance challenge with a practical answer. "We're doing this, we're funding that, we're pushing this agency, we're cutting this red tape." The answers were boring, and boring was the point. She was trying to rebuild credibility with the one tool she'd never needed before: proof. Slowly, the national conversation loosened its grip on her. Not because she'd won it back, but because the country always moves on to the next shiny disaster. Trump found another opponent to mock, another story to dominate, another spectacle to monetize. Cable news found another outrage cycle, because outrage is the only renewable energy source in American media. The youth base stayed loyal, because loyalty is what youth does best when it believes it's defending a cause. And Ocasio-Cortez found herself in the quiet aftermath, staring at a career that might still go anywhere but could no longer go there the same way. The debate didn't end her, because American politics rarely ends anyone cleanly anymore. It reclassified her, which can be worse. It moved her from inevitable to possible, from future president to strong communicator, from movement leader to talented legislator who needs seasoning. That might sound like respect, and in some ways it is. But if you're a politician who built your rise on momentum, seasoning feels like handcuffs. It's what people tell you when they're ready to follow you into power. Ocasio-Cortez's problem now was not Trump. Trump had done his part, delivered his line, collected his clips, and moved on. Her problem was the sentence that had become lodged in the public mind like a splinter: fix home. That sentence followed her into every interview, every town hall, every fundraiser, every donor meeting. It followed her into the eyes of voters who liked her but didn't trust her. It followed her into her own head at night when the phone was finally face down and the room was finally quiet. If she wanted to run again, really run, not trend, she would need to make the splinter a scar. A scar is damage with healing, proof you survived, proof you learned, proof you changed. A splinter is ongoing irritation, a small thing that keeps hurting because you never removed it. So she started removing it one painful inch at a time, doing the work that doesn't get applause. And that's where the story actually gets interesting, because the most dramatic question in her life was no longer whether she could fight. It was whether she could become the kind of politician whose victories aren't clips, but changes people can feel.